last time we spent the whole time talking about the male reproductive system, and today we'll spend our 50 minutes on the female system, and then on Monday we'll finish the female system and we'll talk about the development. All right, so just like we saw for the male, we have these various categories of organs. Changing. Okay. So we have the gonads. The gonads are, by definition, what produce gametes. So we saw in the male that the gonad was the testes. The testes produces sperm. In the female, the gonad is the ovary, and the gamete is the ovum, or oocyte. So we have that. We'll see some pictures of that. We have the external genitalia is everything you can see from the outside. We'll talk about that later on. And then, in addition to the gonads, for reproduction to occur, we have other components of the female reproductive tract, right? So we have the uterine tubes, we have the uterus, and we have the vagina. So we're going to talk about all those things today. And then for the female, we also include the mammary glands in the reproductive system because they are important to nourish the infant until the infant can eat the same foods that the adults eat. So we'll talk a little bit about that and lactation. All right, so sagittal section, like we saw in the male, is oftentimes the best way to see the parts of what we find in the pelvis. So the pelvis is this area right here. It's kind of a bowl-shaped area at the bottom of the abdominal cavity. And from front to back here, we have, here's the pubic symphysis. That's where the pelvic crest or the pelvic girdle comes around and joins in the front, right? Behind that is the urinary bladder. So this is a mostly empty bladder. Here's the urethra right here. Behind the bladder is the uterus, which is right here. And the part of the uterus that projects into the vagina, which is right here, is called the cervix. Better pictures of that to come. You'll note that in the picture, the uterus leans forward. And that is the quote-unquote normal, because that's what most women have, is a uterus that tips a little bit forward. However, it's not universal. There is significant variation in the non-pregnant position of the uterus. So this is what we call anteverted. In other words, it leans forward. But you can have a uterus that's straight up and down. You can have a uterus that leans backwards. So there is some variation there. And it can matter, the position of the uterus can matter in pregnancy because, if you have a uterus that tips the other direction, it means that fertilization or implantation, where the baby ends up in the uterus, can be different than you would see in a uterus that points forward. So the only time it ever really comes up is in obstetrics, when the position of the uterus can matter. All right, and then behind or above the uterus here's the ovary right here, posterior abdominal wall. It's kind of attached there. And then here's the uterine tube sort of reaching up and around. Much better pictures of that to come. And then at the back, we have the rest of the GI tract. So we have the rectum and anus here at the bottom. All right. Okay. So the relationship of the ovaries and the uterus and uterine tubes is represented here. All right. So the uterus, which there's a better picture of, but it's basically a muscular compartment that in non-pregnant females is really quite small. The uterus is only about that big, across in the non-pregnant female. So you're not talking about a very big thing. And it has tubes at the top called the uterine tubes. They used to be called the fallopian tubes. That's probably what you all learned in high school. But the uterine tubes sort of reach up and around, and they end in what's called an infundibulum, which is just an expansion. So the infundibulum is this larger part here, and then at the edges of the infundibulum are fimbria. Fimbria are like fingers that sort of wrap around the ovary. Now, in our picture, the uterine tube is being pulled on a little bit by an instrument. And the reason for that is to show you that the uterine tube and the ovary are not connected to each other. They are close to one another. The fibria kind of wrap around the ovary, but they're not connected, which means that there's a gap between the ovary and the uterine tube. And that can matter because in ovulation, essentially an ovum kind of pops out of one of the ovaries and then has to travel across that gap in order to get into the uterine tube. So an ovum can be lost into the abdomen because of this space or gap between the ovary and the infundibulum of the uterine tube. All right. And then, okay, so we're going to talk more about the parts of the uterus in a minute, but the part of the uterus that projects into the vagina here, this is called the cervix. So the cervix has an opening in the middle called an os. So we have an external os of the cervix, and then there's an internal os as well. Os is just opening. Okay, so it's a tiny hole is an os. All right. And then up here in the corner, we talked at some length about the anatomy of the testes, and we don't talk very much about the anatomy of the ovary because there isn't much of one. It is a very loosely organized organ. So, and we'll see that inside things sort of change according to the uterine cycle or the ovarian cycle, but there just isn't an organization. If you took an ovary and you cut it down the middle and you looked inside, you wouldn't see much. So it looks just kind of like a solid mass with blood vessels going in and coming out of it. So that's all this is showing you here is the ovary doesn't have a complex anatomy on the inside. All right. So in the male, gametogenesis, the formation of gametes, is spermatogenesis, right? Because the male gamete is the sperm. Well, in the female, the gamete is the ovum, and we call the process that ova develop oogenesis. So yes, you say both O's. So it's oogenesis, not oogenesis, right? And it has the same steps that we saw in male. We have mitosis, meiosis 1, meiosis 2. However, the timing is very, very different. And that brings up, a very interesting topic in the reproductive system, which is that the male and female have two very different strategies for gamete production. In the male, as we saw, the male system creates huge numbers of gametes all throughout adult life, from puberty onward. However, the female system produces a small number of gametes before birth, and then matures one and only one, well, typically one, each ovarian cycle. So the male system is all about quantity, and the female system is all about resources. In other words, each gamete that the female produces or matures has gotten a ton of resources added to it, as we'll see here in a minute. All right, so before the baby is born, before the infant girl is born, this mitosis step up here has already completed. So in the ovary, during development, oogonium becomes primary oocyte through cell division. And you don't need to know oogonium, but I do want you to know that the infant girl is born with primary oocytes, a whole bunch of them. Much smaller number than the male sperm production, but still thousands of primary oocytes are present at when the baby girl is born. And they have actually started meiosis 1 before birth, but right here it's halted. So from birth to puberty, all of the female gametes, all of what will become the ovum, the primary oocytes, are sort of suspended in the very first part of meiosis 1. All right? So all this from here on up is before birth, and from here on down is after puberty, right? Okay. So we are stuck there, and then after puberty begins, the cycle, the monthly cycle called the ovarian cycle begins, and with each ovarian cycle, one primary oocyte finishes this journey. So it makes its way through meiosis 1 and meiosis 2, and eventually develops into a mature ovum. All right, so when we looked at the male, we saw that essentially one cell became 4 identical cells, right? And each of these 4 spermatids went on to become a spermatozoa. So that's the male version. The female version is one cell becomes still 4 cells. It has to be like that because that's how meiosis works. But instead of 4 equal cells, in the female we get 1 giant cell and 3 little cells instead. So the strategy here is, for the male, it's all about, make a bunch of identical or very similar gametes. For the female, take all of the resources from the original cell, put them all in one cell. So what we have in the end is we have ovum, this will be the mature ovum, and then we have 3 polar bodies, right? So 3 of these, 2 from here, well, this one divides, but anyway, we get 3 and 1. And the reason for that is this ovum is going to have to support the beginnings of conception. In other words, after fertilization, the ovum has to have enough resources in it to survive until implantation can occur. Implantation is where the fertilized egg buries itself in the uterus, in the endometrium, and that's several days after fertilization. So this cell has to be able to support itself for several days before it gets any help from mom in terms of placenta or blood flow or things like that. So the strategy is to make one giant cell that has the resources of 4 cells, essentially. So it means the ova is one of the larger cells that we see in the body because it's essentially 4 times as big as a regular cell is. They're also the largest cells on Earth. So, an ostrich egg, which is like, that big, is 1 cell. It's a single cell. It's just a huge one. So other animals use this same idea of, put a bunch of resources in 1 giant cell so that it can survive on its own for a time, right? All right, so instead of 4 mature gametes, we get 1 giant gamete and then the 3 polar bodies. Okay, so all of this text in here, you can just sort of cross out in your notes because I'm not going to ask you any of the details about this. I just want you to know that primary oocytes are before birth, all this is after birth, and we get 1 giant cell and 3 little cells. Okay, so this part is what I want you to know, not all this text. Okay, all right, so there are cycles in the female reproductive system, and they're all interconnected, right? So the 2 big ones that we talk about are the ovarian cycle, what happens in the ovary, and the uterine cycle. And in other words, what happens in the uterus, particularly with the endometrium. And the 2 are related because they have a common source, which is the ovarian cycle. So it's changes in the ovary that are driven by changes in the pituitary gland that drives what we refer to as the menstrual cycle or the ovarian cycle. So so as we go from primary oocyte to mature ovum, this is the process that's happening with each menstrual cycle, with each ovarian cycle, as we go from here to here. So what does that look like? Okay, so here's our ovary, and the process, the ovarian cycle is a bit like this. So The pituitary gland releases a hormone called FSH, which we're going to talk more about later, but that's follicle-stimulating hormone. In response to follicle-stimulating hormone, the ovary creates a follicle. So not surprising, follicle-stimulating hormone makes a follicle. Where? In the ovary. And a follicle is a primary oocyte that is maturing into a mature ovum. All right? So that's inside this follicle that develops is the rest of meiosis. So this to this occurs inside a follicle. And what that looks like is, here we have the primary oocyte, and it starts to develop, and typically it's one primary oocyte per menstrual cycle goes through this process. Now, there are times when more than one goes through this process. So, like, one of the ways you can end up with twins is if you started with 2 ova instead of 1. So then you have fraternal twins, right? Twins that are non-identical. It is not, it's uncommon, but it's common enough where you do see that quite often. All right, so primary oocyte starts to develop. As it does so here in the middle this is the primary oocyte. You can see that it's getting much larger than the cells around it. And that continues. And then eventually we get this kind of a bubble sort of structure. So here's the oocyte, and then surrounding it is this area that has some fluid in it. So this is what we would call a mature follicle. It has a mature oocyte in it, and it has this sort of almost gland-like structure. This is a better picture. This has fluid inside. Here's that primary, or that mature ovum. So that's a mature follicle. Here again, all this text is more detail than I care for you to know. I just want you to know that we have a primary oocyte that develops into a follicle. Then that follicle ruptures. That is ovulation. You can see that this has gotten larger and it's gotten more fluid filled. Well, in ovulation, this sort of fluid collection breaks open. So right through the wall of the ovary, that's ovulation, is the follicle breaks open and the ovum is released. So the ovum comes out, so that's ovulation. They're showing you here that tertiary follicle kind of ruptures and the egg leaves right here. And then what's left behind, this follicle structure transforms now into a new structure called a corpus luteum. So we go from this kind of empty or fluid-filled sac that breaks to this sort of mass of cells that has a little fluid in the middle. And then that corpus luteum, if there's no implantation, in other words, if there's no fertilization and of an egg, and that fertilized egg doesn't implant in the uterus, that corpus luteum only lives for about 12 days, and then it sort of disappears, and it becomes a corpus albicans, which is a dying corpus luteum, essentially, right? So this, and then this cycle repeats. So, then a new primary oocyte will develop into a new follicle. That new follicle will mature. Ovulation will occur. That what was the follicle becomes a corpus luteum, and we go around and around and around, right? Every 28 days or so. So the follicle and the corpus luteum have important functions hormonally. So of note, and we're going to talk more about this in a minute, but the follicle produces estrogen, and lots of it. So when the follicle is looking like this, a lot of what is in here is estrogen. So produces estrogen. After ovulation, the corpus luteum produces primarily progesterone and a little bit of estrogen. So when we get to the hormone cycle, which may be today and maybe next time, those two things are going to play an important role. So if you might say estrogen next to a follicle, and estrogen and progesterone next to corpus luteum. All right. So the uterus has the most complex anatomy probably of any part of the female reproductive tract. So, here's the ovary. Here's the ovary. The infundibulum is this expansion at the end of the uterine tube. The fimbria are the fingers that are sort of coming off that. The ampulla is the highest point of the uterine tube, so it kind of goes up and then down. So the ampulla is this piece. The isthmus is the narrowest part here, and then the uterine tube connects to the uterus up here at the top. So egg is released here from ovulation. The epithelium of the tube here has cilia on it. A ciliated cell looks like this, so it has little cilia at the top. And these cilia beat like people rowing a boat, right? So they all beat together. And what they do is they have a tendency to move fluid from here to here. So as the egg is released, those cilia help to move it along this journey here, right? Because eventually we want a fertilized egg implanted in the uterus, so it has to get there somehow. And the cilia participate in that. So they are constantly moving fluid in this direction. Okay. And then we get into the uterus. The uterus has 3 regions. The fundus is the dome-shaped top part. The body is the large part here in the middle. And then the sort of funnel-shaped end of the uterus is the cervix, which is down here. The uterus has a lumen. In other words, it's open on the inside. And that lumen has parts. So the very entry to the uterus, this is the external os, which is right here. It's kind of a hole right in the middle of the cervix. We have the cervical canal, and then we have an internal os that opens into the uterine cavity. So this path, the cervical canal, from internal to canal to external os, is the connection between the uterus and the vagina below it. And then the uterine wall has 3 layers. The endometrium is the inner lining, and the endometrium gets a lot of attention because it changes with the ovarian cycle. So as the ovary, first produces a follicle producing estrogen, ovulation occurs, then it's estrogen and progesterone. Those hormones affect the endometrium rather remarkably, as we'll see here in a minute. So that innermost lining of the uterus is the endometrium. In a pregnancy, it's the endometrium that creates mom's side of the placenta, right? Because as we'll see on Monday, the baby makes half the placenta and mom makes the other half. So mom's half is made in the endometrium. Underneath the endometrium is the muscly part of the uterus. That's the myometrium. And the myometrium, in the end, is going to expel the baby. It's going to push the baby out. And when the uterus is non-pregnant like this and small, the myometrium is sort of thick, and almost rubbery in consistency. And then the outermost part of the uterus is the perimetrium, which nobody ever talks about. So the myometrium comes up because it's functional, the endometrium because it goes through the change, but the perimetrium is just what you call the outermost wall of it. All right. I think that is all. Okay. So if we zoom in and we look at this lining of the uterus, we can see a little bit of what it looks like. All right, so here's the myometrium, right, the muscle part. Here's the endometrium on the inside. And the endometrium responds to events in the ovary. So there's 2 responses. One is proliferation. That's getting thicker, right? The other is transformation, or becoming more secretory. And estrogen and progesterone both have effects on the endometrium, but their effects are different. Okay, so In the first part of the ovarian cycle, as the follicle is developing, the follicle produces estrogen. Estrogen causes proliferation of the endometrium. So what does that mean? It means that the endometrium gets taller and taller. So like, if we're here at the beginning of the menstrual cycle, the endometrium will get thicker and thicker in response to the presence of estrogen. After ovulation, that follicle becomes a corpus luteum. The corpus luteum secretes primarily progesterone, although it secretes estrogen as well. So when progesterone is present, the endometrium becomes more glandular. So what does that mean? Well, glands secrete stuff, right? And are sort of liquidy and mushy, for lack of better terms. So in response to progesterone, the now thickened endometrium transforms to be very glandular. And the reason for that is if there's a pregnancy and a fertilized egg lands in the endometrium, and it usually lands like right about here or here, so it kind of comes down and goes here or there. If there's an implantation, the endometrium has to have a lot of resources for that fertilized egg to thrive. So it gets ready for that by progesterone and the changes that it makes, right? So let's see, I got lost. All right, so first it gets thick, then it gets glandular, and then if there's no pregnancy, that corpus luteum in the ovary, it only lasts for about 12 days. So when it starts to disappear, the estrogen levels drop, the progesterone levels drop, because that's what it's been making, right? Progesterone and estrogen. If you take away the source of the thing, well, those hormones are going to drop. When they drop, the endometrium kind of falls apart, because without progesterone, or without estrogen or progesterone, the endometrium is it's not stimulated anymore, so it starts to disintegrate. And that disintegrating tissue is then what becomes the menstrual flow. So we have tissue, we have blood as part of that, and this tissue evolved for this mechanism, as we'll see here in a minute, because I've got a better picture, I think. All right. So there are two zones to the endometrium. The functional zone is up here. It's the part that changes, right? The functional zone, the top part, gets thicker by estrogen's influence, more glandular by progesterone's influence, and then it sloughs off. It disintegrates when those hormones are not around. And then down here at the bottom, we have this zone called the basilar zone. It's present all the time, which kind of makes sense because there has to be something to grow in the first place, right? So the basilar zone is present all the time, and then under the influence of estrogen, the basilar zone grows a new functional zone every menstrual cycle. All right. I thought I had a better picture than that. I guess I don't. I guess this is the picture I'm looking for. All right. So this tissue has a unique blood supply, which we see here and here, because it has these things called spiral arteries. These arteries can get longer and shorter without having to grow new tissue. Like you think about a spring, like a slinky. You can stretch it and make it longer, and you can let it go, and it'll go back and get shorter again. These spiral arteries work in that same fashion. As the functional zone gets thicker, they stretch out, but then as the functional zone disappears at the end of the corpus luteum's lifetime or lifespan, then they shrink back down so that the endometrium doesn't have to grow new arteries all the time, which is kind of smart, evolutionarily, because building arteries is hard. Building endometrial tissue is easy. So these during menstruation, these spiral arteries contract back towards the basilar zone, so that the blood flow, or blood loss at least, is reduced. So you can see there are spiral arteries here. Okay. All right, so this is just an example of what that uterine cycle looks like. So the uterine cycle is what's happening with the endometrium in every ovarian cycle. So the pituitary drives the ovary, and then the ovaries hormones change what is happening in the endometrium. All right, so to orient you, okay, so here's the myometrium, and then on top, this is the basilar zone of the endometrium, is this area right here. So this would be immediately following menses. So we have not a very thick endometrium at all, right? So very, very thin. So that's there. As the ovary produces a follicle, the follicle produces estrogen, and estrogen causes this basilar zone to divide, to proliferate, to get thicker. Cell division, cell division, cell division, right? So we go from a very thin basilar zone here to now it's very thick. So this area is this area right here. So all this stuff has been added under the influence of estrogen, right? And then ovulation takes place, and the corpus luteum is formed. Corpus luteum produces progesterone, and this kind of tissue becomes this kind of tissue. I mean, I think you can see the change is sort of significant, right? And what we're seeing here is all this, what looks like open space, is filled with secretions of nutrients, essentially. Glycogen, amino acids, lipids, all things that a fertilized egg, a zygote, could find very useful in its development. So we get thick here, and then we transform in the secretory phase. And then as the corpus luteum disintegrates, now all of this tissue, down to about here, is going to slough off, and then we'll be back to here again. So it's the connection between the ovary and the uterus. Okay, and good. So the whole point is this phase right here. Because remember, the reason the menstrual cycle exists is to accommodate or allow for a pregnancy. So if if the functional zone during the secretory phase is very, resource rich, then if there is a fertilized egg that falls there, it will do quite well because it's already ready to accept a pregnancy. All right. So we'll get to the hormone part of that here in a minute when we get to talking about the physiology. All right, so this is all anatomy you should know. It's also anatomy that you've probably learned before, So you've got the labia majora, you have the labia minora. The vestibule is the opening to the vagina, which is down here. Of particular clinical relevance is this right here, the opening of the urethra. Many of you are going to be putting catheters in patients, and there are numerous stories of a catheter not being in the right hole, so to speak. So you do want to pay attention to, it's the opening is between the clitoris and the opening of the vagina, and sometimes it can be hard to find, but practice makes perfect is sort of that one. All right, onward. Okay, the mammary gland only looks like this picture during pregnancy or during lactation. So the breast has kind of two modes. In the non-pregnant female, there are some rudimentary duct systems. The ligaments are present, and then the fat is present. But there aren't actually glands like this in the non-pregnant, non-lactating female. Okay? So during pregnancy, particularly in the last trimester, under the influence of progesterone, estrogen, and to some extent prolactin, the breast develops these glandular structures inside, right? And the structure of the mammary gland, it's hard to represent in two dimensions like this, but it's sort of a radial orientation. So like the spokes on a tire or the spokes on a bicycle tire, that's sort of how these glands are arranged around the nipple in the center. So we have these sort of bag-like structures here, and then they connect to a duct called the lactiferous duct. Lactiferous ducts open onto the surface of the nipple. There are multiple openings on the surface of the nipple. You know, in a bottle you buy at the store, there's one hole. For the human breast, there's multiple holes. So milk emerges from the breast from multiple ducts at the same time. The milk is formed inside these bags right here. Sort of bag shape. That's an alveolus. Another name for that is a bag. So just like the lung has alveoli, the mammary gland has alveoli too. But instead of being filled with air, they fill up with milk as these cells produce milk. And this organization or anatomy is maintained as long as breastfeeding is occurring. Prolactin is released, and prolactin keeps the mammary gland secreting and in this structure. After lactation ends, so after the baby is weaned off of milk, then the breast goes back to its pre-pregnant state, where these glands then disappear, essentially, they involute, and then all we have left is the fat and the ligaments there. And another point, I used to be a pediatrician and got to talk a lot to parents about breastfeeding. And one of the biggest differences between feeding a baby with a bottle and feeding a baby at the breast is this little tidbit down here. These sacs, these alveolar sacs, are sort of unique in the body because they have kind of like smooth muscle inside the cells. And what it means is when the baby goes to breast, the brain releases the hormone oxytocin. Oxytocin causes these alveoli to contract, and they're full of milk. While baby's been sleeping, the alveoli have filled back up. So the long and short of it is, at the breast, milk is actually pushed towards the baby. The common idea is the baby has to draw the milk out with suction. That isn't the case. Once oxytocin gets flowing, the alveoli actually contract and push milk out towards the baby. So it can even overwhelm the baby's ability to swallow that fast. I mean, the baby can have to take a break because the milk is coming out so quickly. So all that, one of the benefits of breastfeeding is since the baby doesn't have to create the suction, they don't suck in as much air as they eat. So air in baby bellies are crying babies, are sad, upset babies. So it's just one of the benefits there. All right, so.
When is it when you are breastfeeding a baby and say you're away from your baby but you hear a baby crying, your body automatically starts.
Yep, starts that letdown thing, right?
Awful.
Yes, it's because oxytocin comes from the brain. So anytime the brain thinks, oh, it's time to feed the baby, oxytocin is released, and there you go. So yes,
So weird how that happens.
Yes, it's a very common thing.
Awful, especially when I was breastfeeding twins. Oh my god.
But breastfeeding really is best. So certainly put that on your list of things to look into when you have children. Okay, so we'll end here, I think. We're going to finish this slide, but okay. The hormonal part of the female reproductive system is the hardest bit, okay, because we have hormones from 3 different places and they all sort of interact. So I say up here complex, and what I have tried to do over here is simplify all of this from the book as much as possible. All right, so the easiest way to think of it is there's 3 conditions, right? There's before ovulation, ovulation, and then post-ovulation, right? So before ovulation, we have FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. Let's see if we can find this. Okay, so here, we'll start at the hypothalamus. Ultimately, GnRH controls everything, but GnRH we got stuck there. GnRH controls the whole thing, but it's present most of the time, so we kind of ignore it, at least in most of our thinking about this. But in the end, GnRH stimulates the pituitary to produce FSH and LH. So we have production of FSH, production of LH. So FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, does just what its name suggests. It stimulates follicles. So under the influence of follicle stimulating hormone, a follicle develops, right? And the follicle secretes estrogen, as we'll see here in a minute. So FSH makes for estrogen, and estrogen inhibits luteinizing hormone. So GnRH is trying to make FSH and LH happen. But as long as estrogen is present from the follicle, LH is inhibited. So that stays down, at least for about 10 days. And then eventually, as the estrogen level gets high enough, this relationship flips. So when estrogen levels are low, luteinizing hormone is inhibited. But when estrogen levels get very high, estrogen or LH is not inhibited and is stimulated. So here, after day 10, in other words, when there's lots of estrogen, LH is stimulated. LH is the ovulation hormone. Okay, it's called luteinizing hormone. So we have. Okay. So we go from follicle, right, to corpus luteum. Corpus luteum. Right, we saw that in the ovary. You know, how do we get from here to here? Well, ovulation, right? Ovulation turns a follicle into a corpus luteum. So what triggers this is LH. So luteinizing, as in corpus luteum. So luteinizing hormone luteinizes the follicle, right? It turns a follicle into a corpus luteum. How do you luteinize a thing? You cause ovulation. So that's sort of the connection right in the center of the ovarian cycle is LH. So the follicle produces estrogen. Estrogen eventually stimulates LH. LH triggers ovulation, and the follicle becomes a corpus luteum. So that's sort of the middle point of the ovarian and uterine cycles. So then after ovulation, that corpus luteum, it produces both progesterone and estrogen. Progesterone, where is that here? See. Okay, so LH triggers ovulation, corpus luteum formation. It produces progesterone. Progesterone inhibits GnRH. So essentially, when progesterone is present, the whole system is turned off. So when there's progesterone, there's very little FSH, there's very little LH, right? And then, so as long as progesterone is around, there won't be the development of a new follicle, all right? And there's, next time we'll go through a better picture of this. But this last bit is important. So estrogen comes from follicle, right? Follicle becomes a luteum through ovulation. Luteum produces progesterone. Progesterone, that's this block right here, turns the whole system off by inhibiting GnRH. So why make such a big deal about that? Because this is why progesterone birth control pills work. Because progesterone blocks the release of GnRH. If you have no GnRH, you're not creating follicles, so you're not maturing an ovum. You have no ovulation, so there's no way you can get pregnant, right? So the progesterone-only birth control methods like the pill or the Depo-Provera work by this system right here, which is why I'm stopping to talk a little bit about it, because you'll hear about lots of your patients will be on progesterone birth control pills. Now, why did evolution make that? It makes perfect sense because the time you have progesterone for the longest is in a pregnancy. You can't have a pregnancy without progesterone. If progesterone is present, GnRH is blocked because the last thing you want in a pregnancy is to create a new ovum, have ovulation, and then have a second fertilization, right? So while the female is pregnant, progesterone levels are high, that blocks GnRH and blocks the formation of any new mature ovum, right? So, huh?
Can that happen?
Can what happen? Can you get pregnant again while you're pregnant? No, because of this system. Aren't we glad for that?
Yeah, just wondering.
Yeah. So it's this blockade that is so important. So now what happens if you're not pregnant though? Well, eventually the corpus luteum disappears, right? Because it only lives for so long. When it involutes, the secretion of progesterone is stopped. That releases the inhibition on GnRH. So when the corpus luteum disappears, GnRH is released again, and now the whole cycle starts again. GnRH stimulates FSH, FSH stimulates follicle, and so on. You know, follicle makes estrogen, estrogen triggers secretion of LH, LH causes ovulation, back to progesterone over and over and over again, right? Okay, so a lot of good stuff on here. It is worth taking some time to go through these boxes because this is complicated stuff and it does come up. You know, because birth control use in this country is so common, we want our healthcare people to understand how it works. You know, it's that so that you can counsel your patients appropriately, and there's no, you know, it's not magic. It's just hormones. All right. So we'll look at all this next time, which will give us another look at this. All right. So we'll call it a day right there. I told you that the female system was quite a bit more complicated.
Just a little.